Tell us about where Chris Dobson came from.
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it, but actually I think illustrates a number of things about, if you like, how one ends up in a place that perhaps one didn't expect to be. I mean, my parents, my family comes from Bradford in Yorkshire. Both my parents left school at 14 or 15, which is school leaving age in those days. My mother went to work. Her father died, she had to work. My father went to work in the wool exchange, buying lots of wool from Australia. And he also went to college to increase his sort of financial skills. But then in 1939, the outbreak of war, he joined the army as a private soldier. And we then, of course, moved away, or the family moved away from, or he moved away from Bradford. He became an officer through the mechanism that existed in those days. Married my mother, who'd been his childhood sweetheart in Bradford. And then after the end of the war, he was posted to Germany, and that was one of the results. I was born in Germany in October 1949. That's the christening. I believe I'm the one with the arrow pointing.
Yeah, I think so. I'm hoping I got that right.
My mother is holding me, I think. My father's on the right. I'm not sure who the person with very large ears is, but, but it's a very impressive fashion statement. So that was the, and that's my elder brother and elder sister standing there. I'm not sure who the other person is. It doesn't look as if he's very sure either. So. But that's really how I came to into the world, and we lived in Germany for nearly a year before going back to England.
Okay, and the next photo. Tell us about that.
Well, this is actually this is a very formative part of my life. In 1955, my father was posted to Lagos in Nigeria. His profession, if you like, in the army was to do with supplies, and Nigeria was still a colony then, and as one did, the younger children at least went out as well. So at the age of 5, I found myself in Lagos, and I think that's probably me looking a bit shy, standing there. But I lived then in Nigeria for 3 years, and it was really fantastic time. The people were wonderful. The beaches were rather like outside. It was completely safe. I used to wander the local markets at the age of 5 or 6. We used to go through the mangrove swamps, drive through to other towns, and the people were lovely. And I think it really gave me perhaps the first taste of the fact that, you know, other countries were interesting and other people were interesting, and that it gave me a view of the world that I'm sure I would not have got otherwise. But it's interesting that, you know, it was really, in my case, the army that actually generated the mobility that took me to different parts of the world. Most of my relatives remained in Yorkshire and are still there. We get on very well with them, but we sort of moved into a slightly different aspect of life through the military angle.
Okay, and I think the next question, sorry, the next photo, yes. That is you, correct?
I think so, yes. I can tell from the colour of the hair and the slimness of the body. It obviously was me.
So was there anything notable to recall from that period?
Well, again, you know, I think one of the things that I hope comes across is you know, how much of what happens in one's life is by chance. So my parents went back to England. My mother, although she left school at 14, was very clever. She taught me. I'd been in a variety of schools up to then. She taught me, and we passed the so-called 11 plus, so I could go to free to a grammar school, a direct grant school. And I can't say it was a great brilliant scholar at school, and the school told me there was no chance of me getting into Oxford, let alone Cambridge. But I did rather well in my examinations, and again, things that couldn't happen nowadays. Someone in Oxford got to hear of it. I was going to another university in the UK, and they said, "Come down and see us." And on the basis of having a cup of tea with a rather aged theologian, I left with saying, "See you October." And so I arrived in Oxford rather unusual way. During my first term, I remember being, I had formally to apply to Oxford, and I'd been there for probably about 4 to 6 weeks, and a letter came from the university's admissions office telling me very politely but firmly that my application to Oxford had been turned down. But as I was already there, I just put it in a drawer and never opened it again, and nothing else happened. So, you know, these things don't happen nowadays, you know. It's
so sure.
And so that was me in 1967. I was just 18 as an undergraduate to Oxford. I think relative to some of the others, perhaps it is a good-looking one, but it's all relative. And that was really changed my life. You know, I went to going to university like everyone here, I'm sure, finds. You have a different view on the world. You meet people with completely different opinions and realise that they might have totally different views or come from totally different backgrounds, but they're fantastic people as well, and that was another very important
Okay, so here's a question, just like when you first got to Oxford, did you know what you wanted to do?
I had no idea. Well, I wanted to survive, actually, the first few weeks, because it was very tough, I can tell you. Not at all. I mean, I originally had actually been very interested in the classics and Latin and Greek at school. In fact, I chose, rather unfortunately, to do at the age of 14 to do Greek rather than biology, and so I never did any biology, which probably shows. But you know, as so often, it's a teacher who really makes a big difference. There was a really fantastic teacher of chemistry, and it was really his inspiration that encouraged me to focus on science, and he taught very well, and that's how I did well in my examinations, and that's how I got to Oxford. But it was, again, for chance really. It was a great teacher, and but already I had this sort of feeling that I think many people have, that actually, you know, if one has a life in front of one, one would like to do something that really could make a difference. And science, of course, is I think the extreme case of that, where you can discover things about the world and really feel that you've made a difference. So that was already beginning to be part of my thinking.
You started at that point, so you ended up being a chemist initially.
That's right.
And what I never heard is, what sort of chemist?
Well, I was a sort of chemist. I mean, in Oxford you did chemistry.
Just general.
And I quite liked all of it. But how I got into my PhD, or DPhil as it is in Oxford, I actually did a summer project that was actually not very biological. It was actually on the corrosion of iron using Mossbauer spectroscopy, that most people probably haven't heard of. And then when it came to choose a subject for what was then called a Part 2, now be a master's degree, the person I was working with was leaving, and I went to see R.J.P. Williams, who was in the inorganic chemistry laboratory, and he was the only person I knew who did Mossbauer spectroscopy, and I thought this would be an interesting thing to do. But he was one of these real pioneers who was moving from chemistry into biology, and he had just started to get interested in NMR spectroscopy. So, in fact, I'd never touched a Mossbauer spectrometer again, which is probably a very good thing. and started doing NMR spectroscopy and started looking at biological systems. So again, it was a bit of a surprise, but actually then I realized that actually if you wanted to discover things about the world, there were a lot worse things to discover about than life and so on. So it was again something of an accident.
Okay, so this next photo, I think, puts you in a lab type setting here.
Yes, I think by then I was getting to the stage when I wasn't allowed to go in the lab. But
Already.
exactly. I was an undergraduate course in Oxford. I went to RJP Williams after my what would be a master's degree. Now I did a doctoral degree, and that's when I started working with proteins. That was really just at the beginning of the time when it was beginning possible to do structural studies of proteins. And you have to remember that in the 1960s, when I was a student, the first protein crystal structures were coming out. So it was right at the beginning of structural biology. And so I did NMR spectroscopy. We started to do NMR of proteins. And the reason that I'm in Harvard is because Martin Karplus, who became still is a very close friend, visited and encouraged me to go to what was then the National Magnet Laboratory at MIT. And I said I didn't really want to go to a laboratory. I'd much rather go to a university. And I was offered an assistant professorship at Harvard. And this is my research group, 3 years on. And the person in the middle, the young lady in the middle, is Christina Redfield, who is a professor in Oxford now. She moved with me to, two of the people there moved with me back to England when I went back to Oxford in the just after that, early 1980s. And she stayed there, and she's a very successful scientist.
Okay, so so you started off as a chemist. You sort of migrated towards structure, and then you began sort of some of the early studies of protein structures, and then what made you move from that to then looking at protein misfolding and diseases?
Well, that's again an interesting issue. I worked very closely with another late Ian Campbell, who was in Oxford doing NMR spectroscopy, and it was just at the time when one was beginning to determine structures of small molecules and then larger molecules. And the first thing that I was trying to do as a graduate student was to see if you could determine the structures of proteins in solution. And we did, I think, some of the very earliest two-dimensional experiments and measured over-Hausdorff effects and so on. And so it became sort of clear to me that it would be possible to determine the structures of globular proteins in solution. But in fact, I had a sort of feeling that one sort of knew in principle what globular proteins looked like, but what one didn't know was actually how they achieved the structure. And so the idea of actually using NMR spectroscopy, which was a dynamic method, it could look at things in solution, it could look at dynamic processes, to try and understand protein folding was something that really almost from the beginning of my doctoral work began to fascinate me. And so it was again, it was really sort of thinking what might make a difference to our knowledge by doing things that was slightly different, and everybody thought it was completely mad to look at these uninteresting states of proteins, rather than the functional one. But it turned out to be quite a useful start in life.
Okay. And was there some person or event or something you read that made you start pursuing the other direction? So not folding but unfolding.
I think that probably there were a number of people who really had a big influence on me. One was a man called David Phillips, who was in fact the person who determined the first structure an enzyme, Lysozyme, and he had done that at the Royal Institution in London, but then moved to Oxford to take up the first chair of molecular biophysics. In those enlightened days, chemistry or biochemistry wouldn't have him. He ended up in the zoology department, but set up a very stimulating group, and he was one of the people who really influenced my life a lot, and he was really fascinated by the question of protein folding. There's a wonderful picture that was taken at the Royal Institution when he gave a talk about the structure of lysozyme, and it has, it's interesting that Lawrence Bragg was director, good Australian, and he got the Nobel Prize for showing how you could determine the structures of crystals by X-ray diffraction, but he also was director of the Royal Institution when the first enzyme structure was determined. In fact, he drew by hand the fold just looking at the electron density map. It's a really famous picture. And this lecture, the photograph of David Phillips giving the lecture, shows the crystal structure that Bragg had worked on. It showed the structure of lysozyme in its folded state, and it had hanging from the ceiling a long chain of amino acids simulating the unfolded state. And he was asking the question, how do you get from one state to the other? So I think, although I'd been thinking about it before, he was a person who really encouraged me. And although I never worked very closely with him, he was, the sort of person who I would meet from time to time, and he would, ask me questions like, "What's the big problem you're going to solve?" Or, why don't you stick with that, even if, other people say something different? So he had a big influence on me.
Mm. So at the time when you started, how many people were actually in the world who were asking the same questions?
Well, I think, protein folding as a topic really had a sea change with Christian Amundsen, who showed that you could unfold ribonuclease and then refold it, and for which he got he did a few more things than that and got the Nobel Prize. And that really started the realization that you could refold a protein in the lab. And then people started thinking about how to do this. And then there was this the famous Leventhal paradox that said roughly that, how on earth, that there were so many different possible conformations of a protein that it would take the age of the universe for if you were to fold by searching through all of them. So it was clear that there was a mechanism which wasn't like that. And that really started to initiate interest from, a little bit from biochemists, but actually largely from, I would say, from physical chemists and physicists. And one of the people was Martin Karplus, and he was the person who had encouraged me to go to Harvard, and his office was next to mine, and we started to collaborate on projects. And so I don't know the answer to your question, but it was, probably, 20 groups were working on quite actively on protein folding, but not many of those were actually using what I would call biophysical methods.
Okay, let's have a look at the next. Here we're 95, so that's Margaret. Is she here? Margaret?
Well, there's another person who had a big influence on me. I went back to Oxford in the early 1980s, and protein folding was probably the topic, was the topic that we were most interested in. We did a lot of work on it. I kept my contacts with Martin Karplus, who, perhaps also had a huge influence on me because he was a theoretician, I was an experimentalist, and I realized the value of collaboration. And he's a lifelong friend. We published many papers together, and of course he got the Nobel Prize 3 years ago for his theoretical work. But we'd been looking at the folding of proteins, particularly actually lysozymes, through the influence of David Phillips. And in the mid-1990s, it emerged that there were mutations in the lysozyme gene that resulted in people getting huge quantities of protein deposited in liver, kidneys, spleen, and so forth. And so we realized that that these mutations, it was a very rare disease, these mutations actually had given us access to a protein that that was normally functional, but through a mutation could become, could aggregate. And it was recognized, and Mark Peppers, in London we worked with, had shown that if you extracted the deposits, they had amyloid fibrils there. So that was really what started our interest. And we were very lucky at that time that Margie Sunday was working in Oxford. She worked actually with a man called Colin Blake, a really brilliant crystallographer who'd actually worked on the lysozyme structure as well. And they were looking at the structure of, I think, what was then called prealbumin, which is transthyretin. And she had done some really important crystallographic work looking at the X-ray fiber diffraction patterns of the amyloid fibrils from many different proteins. And Colin Blake was retiring, and she decided to move to work with us. She got herself a Medical Research Council fellowship, and she was really the person who was there at the beginning to get us involved in really detailed biophysical studies of amyloid fibrils and the misfolding phenomenon. I'm not sure who else is there. A number of people who Lorna Smith is just to her right. She's also now faculty member in Oxford. I'm not quite sure. I think that was in the University Museum, for all places, in Oxford. There must have been an event there, but my memory is disappearing over that length of time. I'm worried about where to say.
One observation, like I've been to Cambridge many times, and when I go back, it's kind of like an extended family, really. So
yeah.
So you've maintained connections with many people for many years, and so is that something that you, maybe not the right word, but calculatedly, but do you deliberately do that, or is that just comes naturally to you? Do you do it because you know that has value, or because you know it has value and you want to do it, or what's the rationale? Do you have a rationale?
Well, I think I think the value of collaboration to me came about particularly through having an office next to Martin Karplus and realizing that if you had a theoretician and experimentalist together, that actually there were problems you could tackle that you couldn't do otherwise. And I learned a huge amount from him. We had joint students, and as I say, we kept in touch a lot after that. And then when I went back to Oxford and started looking again at protein folding and then at protein misfolding, it was obvious that NMR spectroscopy, which was my original technique, was not going to solve everything. And so we started to get involved with other biophysical techniques, and clearly we could either have tried to develop more ourselves, but we tended to think it was more effective to work with people who are real experts. So, and I think our collaborations were all chosen again by sort of chance in a sense, but with people we got on with. They weren't, if you like, I don't know, they weren't even strategic. They were just, one would go to a meeting and one would talk about what we might do together. And then the other thing which is very important, which I'd learnt actually from R.J.P. Williams, Bob Williams' lab, is in a sense that the really important people in the lab are students and postdocs. And I discovered rapidly that longer I was away from the lab, the more effective everything was. So that made me realise that actually letting people just get on with things and working together was very important. So these collaborations were largely driven actually by students and to some extent postdocs who would then talk to others at meetings. We sent lots of people to meetings, and so they developed sort of naturally, and people in the lab have always been able to do more or less what they wanted if it's not clearly highly dangerous or obviously illegal. And so most of the collaborations actually developed either through meetings at through meetings at conferences, but actually much more through students who met other students and asked if they could go and spend some time in this lab or that lab, and so it really developed from the sort of grassroots, if you like.
And so tell us what took you from Oxford to Cambridge.
Well, you know, to some people this is the biggest transition you can make in the world. To others it's what's the difference? And I suppose there are really two aspects. I was about 50. In fact, my wife, who's a historian of medicine, has had a huge influence on my life in many ways, including actually understanding the history of disease and its treatment. She worked she was head of the unit for the history of medicine. She had nothing to do with patients, but she then got meningitis. And so at the age of 35 or something, she had viral meningitis. We had 2 small children, and she took a long time to recover from that. And she eventually, after a sort of second bout of illness, she decided that really she should take early retirement from that job. So, so she wasn't tied to Oxford. Our children had grown up somewhat, and actually I hadn't really thought much. My wife Mary had always wanted to be in Cambridge. She'd always complained that she only stayed in Oxford because I was there, which I suppose is flattering in a sense, but she mentioned it a bit too often. In fact, I remember she was in hospital, and I was standing outside the hospital, and I got this phone call from Richard Friend in Cambridge saying that they had this so-called John Humphrey Plummer professorship that was not attached to a department. It was no, it was a university appointment, and you could choose which department you wanted to go in, and the electors had met and asked if I would accept it. So I didn't really quite know what to say, so I said, well, what are the duties? And there was a pause. He said, I don't think there are any. So I said, I could probably handle that. So, and of course I had a lot of friends, and it turned out for about perhaps 10 years before that, Alan Furst, there's a really great protein chemist, and I had become friends, and every 6 months we'd have a joint meeting together. So he'd bring his group over to Oxford, always in the summer, and then we went to Cambridge when it was raining in the winter. And we had these really incredible meetings where probably 50 or 60 people, all interested really in protein folding and related subjects, got to know each other and got to trust each other. And so moving to Cambridge was actually to a place that I knew a lot of people, and perhaps that was one reason. The second reason, I think, is that I began to think that I hoped some more years to do research, and actually moving to Cambridge would be exciting. And actually it was very frightening. It's a bit like becoming an assistant professor again. You wonder if anybody will ever work with you and whether you'll manage to fit in. But it turned out for us to be a fantastic move.
Okay. Now let's go to the next slide. What have we got? Okay, so we've jumped quite a long time there.
Well, I suppose this probably I don't know quite where Karen gets all of these, but this was perhaps really to illustrate how important, I suppose, in my life going to, and I think conferences has been. I remember actually, even when I was a young academic, there was a message came around from the research councils as though they discovered this terrible fact that 2 members of the same research group had gone to the same conference, and they thought that this was entirely a waste of money, and I panicked briefly until I realised that there were 5 members of my research group there, and they obviously hadn't found out. So, but actually that meeting, it was on the previous slide now, actually was a Welsh Foundation conference, whatever year it was, probably 10 years ago now. But it was, very interdisciplinary. There was Archimedes Zawale, who, a really great experimentalist. There were Roger Kornberg was there. There were a whole set of people, and so conferences have been a very important part of my life, and actually getting feedback. Particularly, going from chemistry more towards biology and even edging towards medicine. A huge step really was actually being invited to meetings that were outside my comfort zone, and I think this was an example of, actually a terrific meeting that, where I learnt about all sorts of things that were, I wouldn't have discovered otherwise.
That's kind of a prompt for the next question, which is, so your career spanned 40 something
30,
plus.
isn't it? 30.
Is it?
Maybe it's 50 actually. So
4 decades, let's say.
Yeah, let's call it 4 decades.
Okay. So you've seen the beginnings of the field, and so you're here at I guess a fairly typical sort of current day symposium conference. What's changed? Can you comment on how you see things have changed?
Well, first of all, this isn't a common conference. I mean, this is a really special one, I think, because it brings together people interested in a very specific field, many of whom know each other from interactions. So what's changed in science? Well, the most obvious thing, I think, is it's become much more international, much more diverse, and I would say young people, students and so on, have become much more important. I mean, in the old days when it took, it was expensive to go to conferences, they were almost told off if more than one student were to go there. Now, that's what students do. They go to conferences, and you can discover all sorts of things, meet people from different parts of the world, and I think this internationalization of science has been a really positive thing, and of course it's become much more interdisciplinary. I mean, that's a whole lot of people who worked with me in the past, but they include mathematicians, physicists. My 2 closest colleagues, Michaela Vendriscolo and Thomas Knowles, one was a theoretical physicist initially and the other was an experimental physicist. But we've had people who've done neuroscience, we've had people who've done chemistry, physics. And again, I think when I was a student, you didn't do this. You actually thought to be a rather traitor if you wandered over to the biochemistry department if you're a chemist. And so I think there's been a huge change in that. So I think in its internationalization, its diversity, the sort of interdisciplinarity which has come about has been really a very, very positive aspect of science. It's also, perhaps if I could say, the other change was, when I started in the early 70s doing research, so we just knew a few protein structures, and NMR spectroscopy had just begun to be able to determine conformations of small molecules. And so, the thing that's happened, I think, over that length of time is huge developments in methodology, and we saw them at this meeting. Experiments that were unthinkable 40 years ago, looking at single molecules or identifying parts of cells where proteins co-localize, being able to use optical methods to super resolution. I mean, these were not even thought about. So I think the huge expansion in technology and methodology has been really an amazing change, and I think it's. I mean, I wish I was 40 years younger, because I think it really is a golden age now for science. I think there are problems that we perhaps dreamt of solving 40 years ago, which actually now are soluble, and not just in biology, but problems of poverty, climate change, and so on. We have the capacity now, if we want to do, to address these issues, and 40 years ago that was unthinkable.
Okay, so I've now got a double-barrel question for you. So perhaps you could tell us about the new building and what's going to go in Cambridge, and how that relates to the future of research.
Well, I suppose it's a sort of culmination of developments. I mean, we've. I mean, a really key issue is first Michaela van Driscoll, who actually moved in 2001 with me into he's just come now into Cambridge. Thomas Knowles, who became a student about 5 years later. We
told you this chair wouldn't stay still.
Yeah, you're having trouble with that, I can see. You need the bar in front of it with a pint, don't you?
So that'd be better.
But I think we realised that not just we got on very well together, we were complementary. There's the three of us there. I'm now the shortest of the three. I'm sure I wasn't before. But we really decided that we worked very well as a team, and so we started to share money, student space, ideas, and groups got bigger, and so we had this sort of hope that we'd be able to have a place where we could all be located together, and by really again a series of pieces of good fortune, we raised funding for a building and actually also a sort of endowment for the centre. And so the new building, it's an annex, it's attached to chemistry because we need, of course, to use all the services. But the top 2 floors will be what we call the Centre for Misfolding Diseases, which will be our academic groups all together, and we hope lots of collaborators from around the world.
Is that the first one in the world of that sort?
I think it's probably, there are very few things which are the first in the world, but I think what's actually distinguishes what we do from what most other people do is that we are looking at these medical problems, but starting from really a physical point of view. The idea that biology obeys the laws of physics, and that perhaps there could be quantitative ways to look at various issues which were looked at qualitatively before. And again, this work we started with Martin Karplus, bringing together theory and experiment. So I think it's unusual in that sense, and I think it's also unusual for, if you like, PIs to work together for so long. You asked before about long-term collaborations, and we have built on collaborations that started 30 almost more years ago. Some people who'd worked with us and then went elsewhere, some, like there's fantastic links you've had with Wollongong, and happened, I think, by chance. You visited Cambridge. We showed you one of our papers and you told us what rubbish it was, and
That's
we knew,
not quite true.
we knew this was somebody worth collaborating with, and so I think
it was a test.
But it was we failed it. So, but it was, I think it was this culmination of this view that actually working together was partly fun, and science has to be fun, but also that you all add something different to the mixture. I'll at some point officially have to retire, then there'll be a legacy as well of having spent a long time trying to bring a lot of these things together. It will continue, and then the ground floor of the building will be a sort of translational activity where we try and see whether some of the ideas we come up with would convert into potential therapeutics. And then we have it's always in the basement, there's a protein production facility, because if you're in a chemistry department, and we collaborate with many other people in chemistry, indeed physics, making proteins is not something that your average student does on their first day, and so this is really a resource for a much wider range of people, because I think I'm really sort of passionately enthusiastic that physical scientists should get into the life sciences, and you have to make it possible for it to happen.
So you obviously, the whole concept behind that is a positive one of I won't say anticipation, but hope that you will generate, or somebody will generate, treatments for some of these diseases, right?
Yeah.
So you believe in that?
Absolutely profoundly, and I think it's probably for two fundamental reasons. The first, as I said, my wife Mary is a medical historian. She writes fantastic books on medicine. I wouldn't say they were coffee table books. You wouldn't want to read them with your coffee on most occasions, but they're very informative, they're very interesting, and actually she's even written children's books on these topics. And the history of medicine, and we've even given talks together, is that new illnesses come along largely from changes in human. That's my wife. She's the one on the right. And we were married 40 years this year, by the way. If you look through every time a disease came along, it was because of sort of change of human lifestyle. I mean, the old plagues in the classical world were always when the Spartans attacked Athens, everybody rushed into the city, and infection spread very rapidly. And then the Black Death in the 14th century was when more and more people started crossing Asia into Europe and spread disease, which Europeans had no evolutionary protection against. And then, of course, the diseases that were spread to the New World came again from people travelling and bringing diseases which weren't known before. And indeed, diseases came back from the New World, came from the New World to the Old. And but they were, overcome largely. I mean, infectious diseases, perhaps other than sub-Saharan Africa, largely under control, and they could be completely under control if we put our minds to it, I think. But everybody at the time thought that they were incurable, untreatable acts of God, or blamed somebody else for them. And I think the other thing that I sort of learned from her is that if you look back through history, the treatment of disease is almost always after, except occasionally by chance, is always after understanding the fundamental origins of disease. That it's, for the plague, that it actually is a bacterium carried by animals, that cholera was waterborne, and influenza can be carried in various different ways. So I think it's caused by virus, and I think that the issue with many of the diseases we've been talking about this meeting, with misfolding diseases, is that no, they didn't exist as a recognizable problem until recently. I mean, Alzheimer's disease was first described in 1906, and the very unusual case of cognitive dysfunction was a woman of 51, because 51 was pretty old, even in 1906, and she had a familial mutation. Until 1980, if you look through US disease statistics, there was nobody who was reported with Alzheimer's disease. People just got forgetful as they got older, and then of course there are now 100 times more cases than that, partly through diagnosis. So I think that all generations have thought, as their lifestyles change, new diseases appear, that they wouldn't be able to treat them, but science has overcome that, and of course science has never been stronger than it is now, and you can see at this meeting, even compared with previous ones, what progress has been made. So I don't see any reason at all why there shouldn't be.
I wasn't suggesting, I just asked.
No, I know, but it's, I suppose I'm, I would say totally confident there will be
I agree
treatments and prevention. And I think one of the things which is, I'd be most excited about is somebody, finding a drug for these types of disease that actually works even a bit. And then I think people would believe, the public, if you like, would believe that they were treatable and preventable, and that would then unleash the sort of flood of money that came in the 1970s from when Nixon signed the National Cancer Act in the US in 1971, and then of course AIDS gave another additional drive towards addressing cancer, and huge progress has been made. My father died of cancer 45 years ago, and in those days you didn't tell anybody if they had it, because there was no treatment. You said they had indigestion or they were whatever. So now it's a disease that is, I never use the word curable, but is certainly treatable, containable, and and it's because it's much better understood.
I have only one more question, which is a similar question to one Heath asked Ulrich at the end of the 2014 thing, and that is, what advice would you give young people starting research if you had to give them some advice?
Well,
and you do.
I mean, I have a really profound belief that scientific discovery comes from intellectual curiosity. And I think the most important thing is that people should be excited about the science that they're doing, and not driven, at least initially, by finding a drug or solving some problem that will get them immediately into Stockholm. So I think science is fun, it's really exciting, and I think the best thing to do is just enjoy it, find something that's really gets your imagination, and work on it, and but be alive to the fact that actually almost all science has applications to it, and when you stumble over them, then one should take advantage of it. But I think it's really important that one should be, there should be this sort of drive to understand complex problems before you try to convince people you can solve them.
Interestingly, your answer is along similar lines to Ulrich, and Ulrich also made the point that he wished the granting bodies agreed.
Yeah, well, you asked before about changes in science, and I think science has changed. I mentioned some things that's changed for the good, but there are some things which are not so good, and I think this idea of hypothesis-driven research, by the time the grant agencies have realised what's going on, it's already not new anymore, and so forth. So I suppose I think there are two aspects of this. One is that you have to try to convince people that what you're doing is important, and the other is you have to be a master of subterfuge and actually be doing what you're really excited about, and convincing the grant agencies you're doing something else.
Yes.
And the result is probably that you will do something else if you
Yes.
do what you're interested in.
Yes. All right. I'd just like to close up. If there are any questions from the audience that you might like to ask Chris.
I was interested in your comment about the golden age in terms of techniques, and now we're able to address a range of questions that were previously almost unattainable. So with your new institute, do you have any big questions that you are really keen to address that you think are foremost in your mind with the expertise and the people that you've got with you?
Well, I think one of the things, of course, we would really like to do is to understand far more about neurodegenerative diseases and to understand ways of intervening. And I think that's probably our top, if you like, medium-term ambition. But I also think that, one of the things which has been a characteristic of bringing people together from these different disciplines is that new approaches to problems have emerged. I mentioned, I think Thomas Knowles doing with microfluidics, a physicist. He realizes that small volumes, the properties of liquids change, and you can do different types of experiments. Michaela has done fantastic things with simulations, bringing them together with experiment. So I think the aim we'd like to do is clearly to understand these diseases in more detail. We won't do it alone, but I think from a molecular point of view, that's what we'd really like to understand. But I think to do that, I'm sure it'll be necessary to bring in new approaches, new types of people and so forth, and that's another ambition. But perhaps the biggest ambition is the hope that, we've been very lucky. We have brilliant young people from all over the world who've come and worked with us, and you've heard some of them at this meeting, and that's true in so many labs around the world. And I think we'd really like to provide an environment where brilliant young people can do what they want, and by raising money as a sort of endowment for the centre, we can give people a lot more freedom. We can let them escape to some extent from the research council. So where it will go in the future, I'm not going to predict, but in the immediate, in the long-term future, one couldn't predict. But I sometimes think you get people who spend their life doing research and they stop and it sort of disappears. And I think one of the things I'm really proudest of is that this centre will continue through people more brilliant than I am, and also that a large number of people who I've been lucky enough to work with have their own labs, and not only have their own labs, and something nearly 100 people who've been through the lab have got faculty or equivalent positions around the world. And what's really exciting is that many of them work together. And so I think, I hope that this centre will be a way in which people from other countries will come and spend time with us, and there'll be a bigger sharing of information about these issues around the world. If that answers you.
Anyone else?
I have one. So we've had, a very beautiful kind of talk about the many steps that underpin the success of your career. Has there been any moments where it all felt like it was going to fall apart, and if so, what kept you going on, and how did you overcome that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The answer is, of course, yes. There have been many moments where one, almost all the time, the rejection of the grant, the paper being turned down and things, but I think I think persistence is the most important thing in science, and I think having a fantastic set of people working there, it's really the young people in the lab have kept me going more than anybody. And I once also heard a talk from someone who that point was head of the British Army, and there were cuts being made and whatever, and someone said, "Are you optimistic about, you know, a career in the army?" And he said, he thought for a bit, he said, "Yes," he said, "I'm head of the army. If I'm not optimistic, who is?" And, you know, I think, you know, you have to believe that problems will be solved. There will be difficult times, but actually they are, and if you've got enough people working together, they're much more likely to work out. So yes, there've been many moments, but you know, fortunately there have been people around me who've been supportive, and somehow one has sort of got through them.
Thank you.
Good question.
That was good. Okay, so have you ever heard a more gentlemanly genius? And I just want to thank Chris very much.
Well, thank you.
Hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you for